My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of this institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that today's event is being held on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of their country for thousands of years. And we would also like to pay our respect to the First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. We are simply thrilled to present this country's most celebrated and iconic artist and photographer, William Young's exhibition at this place. It is very uplifting to see our show exhibition is being visited daily by our students, staff, and delegations to Western Sydney University. We always direct them to our direction, and the general public. At this university, we all have our own institute or school or division or centre to look after and focus on. And we only need to mind our own business, which keeps us busy already. But for the Vice-Chancellor, everyone's business is his business. And his business is not anyone else's business. How the Vice-Chancellor balances his time, his attention, his support to millions of businesses is beyond my little brain. One thing I know is the Vice-Chancellor is fascinated by how languages work across cultures, and in specific, how subtitling works. Once Vice-Chancellor said to me, quote, "I was thinking while watching a film about the benefits of truly bilingual films." So Vice-Chancellor is not always thinking of big strategic things. And I was wondering about a film in which every character is bilingual, say English and Chinese, and the subtitling reverts between languages, as native English speakers speak English and subtitled in Chinese, and native Chinese speakers speak Chinese and subtitled in English, each translating in their head. So no cultural appropriation and no token characters. End of quote. Problem solved. But you do have to be a mathematician as well as subtitle knowledgeable to work this out. And Vice-Chancellor, I have to say your vision has been realized, at least partially, in the latest movie, Everywhere, Everything Everywhere, All at Once, with Michelle Yeoh being the bilingual leading character, which earned her Golden Globe Award and nomination for the Oscar. And when Vice-Chancellor moved his pre-booked meeting so as he's able to come to open this event, I was beyond moved. I know I will have to work even harder. Please welcome the Vice-Chancellor and the President of Western Sydney University, Professor Barney Glover, AO, to give the opening speech.
Thanks, Jean. That's one of the best introductions I've had. Because Jean is right. I take advantage of Jean travelling with me overseas. That we haven't travelled into China for some time. We are heading off in a week or so. One of the first universities to take a delegation back into China post-COVID, or as we transition out of COVID. So we're both looking forward to it. But in our previous trips, as you know, when you're travelling around any country with colleagues, you're in a car or in an airport or in a hotel foyer or wherever, restaurant, you have those moments where you have a conversation, and I always interrogate Jing about subtitling for a whole variety of reasons, and I find it fascinating. And in this current discussion we're having around generative AI, it raises yet another set of interesting challenges in relation to subtitling and communication and natural language processing and so on. So, Jing, wait for it. When I get there, we're together, I'll be asking you even more. I'll get another tutorial on the fascination that is subtitling. But it's great to be here today, and I was very glad to have an opportunity to move things around to participate. And I appreciate so many of you being here with us today. As is our custom, of course, and very importantly this year, as we begin a dialogue in Australia around the Voice to Parliament and the Uluru Statement from the Heart, I want to acknowledge that today's event's being held on the country of the Barramatical people of the Darug Nation, unceded land, and to acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of their country for tens of thousands of years. And I also acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and particularly welcome anyone here today of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent. It will be a very important period for Australia this year as we begin. We've already begun the dialogue, but I'm sure it will continue on through the course of this year, I think until sometime between October and December, when we have the referendum promised by the Prime Minister. And there is an important role for universities to play, and an important role in education, in perhaps identifying misinformation or debunking myths or whatever it might be, but we have an important role to play. And I'm looking forward to the discussions that will ensue within the university this year. Now, I want to thank a few people and acknowledge a few people, particularly Jing, of course, Professor Jing Han, our Director of the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture. It's great to have a chance to be in another opportunity to celebrate Australia and China in relation to arts and culture. Particular welcome and acknowledgement of our distinguished guests who are with us today. Of course, William Yang, our esteemed artist, and we'll hear more about William in a moment. Tessa Leong, the Artistic Director of Contemporary Asian Australian Performance. Kevin Hopgood-Brown. Kevin is here somewhere. Kevin is here, of course, Chair of the Foundation of Australian Studies in China and a member of our advisory board here at the Institute for some time. It's great to have Kevin with us. Professor Jocelyn Che, an adjunct here at the university, and of course a former director of our institute. So welcome, Jocelyn. Always great to see you. I see in our media monitors often the conversations you're having in various ways. So thank you for that. Simon Chen, the Director of Art Atrium, Professor Mabel Lee from the University of Sydney, and a number of artists who are here. All of them very important. Tian Lee's here. Tian Lee Zhu is here, who painted my portrait. So I look at it frequently and I love it. So thank you, Tian, for doing such a wonderful job. And not only did Tian paint my portrait, which I think is great, but she, in preparation for it, she painted a second, smaller portrait of me, which I have in my office. Perhaps that's a shocking thing to admit, but a portrait in my office as well as in Coburg. But thank you, Tian. Great to have you here. Shen Jiawei and Guo Zhan as well. So it's great to have our artistic colleagues with us. And of course to welcome everyone today to this afternoon's event, the opening ceremony for William's exhibition Claiming Heritage. So we'll hear much more about that shortly. Now, I'm absolutely delighted that Western Sydney University, through our institute, has been given the opportunity to present this unique and distinctive exhibition, Claiming Heritage, by one of Australia's most iconic and influential artists and photographers, William Young. For those not familiar with the university, and I hope there's not too many of you here, but perhaps there are, we certainly are very committed to and we strongly recognise the importance of arts and culture in influencing, opening and challenging minds, both young and old. And the institute that Jing leads plays a very significant role in realising this intent, particularly in its focus on centuries-old and emerging Chinese art, as well as contemporary culture in China, Australia and around the world. And over the years, the Institute has supported and partnered with a new generation of creative minds whose work has been shaped by their multicultural heritage of growing up in Australia. It's very appropriate today to have the exhibition from William. Under Jing's leadership, the IAC has achieved some remarkable success in the delivery of a wide range of programs, particularly in the production of exhibitions which feature well-established, influential Chinese Australian artists, as well as emerging Australian artists of Chinese and Asian heritage. And I think we play a particularly important role, and perhaps to some extent unique role, in amongst the university's here in Sydney. It's fitting then that we now present the work of William Young. Now, William is an extraordinary Australian artist of Chinese heritage who spent his formative years in far north Queensland. His success as an artist and photographer is testament to his talent, his intelligence, creativity, resilience, courage and humanity. William's artistic representations have inspired so many of his generation, and his photographic documentation of the social life of his times and experiences of the gay community is parallel to none. Williams received many awards over the course of his artistic career. In 1989, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of letters from the University of Queensland and is one of 45 Rainbow Champions recognised by Sydney World Pride in representation of the 45 years since the first Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras was held on the 24th of June 1978. William also recently received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Sydney Theatre Company. Great achievements. Now, in viewing this exhibition this evening, we're instantly struck by William Young's personable and artistic power of connecting the audience to the stories held in his photographs and the texts around his images. Each photograph provides incredibly moving and thought-provoking insights into his search for identity and heritage. His portraits range from images of his parents and family to his self-portraiture as a gay man, as an ethnic Chinese descendant and as a performing artist. They include images taken on his trips to China as he searches and reclaims his cultural heritage while at the same time affirming his Australian identity. As a performing artist, William Young has famously integrated his skills as a writer and as a visual artist and created a unique form of performance theatre by performing monologues alongside slide projections in the theatre. These slideshows have since become his favourite way of presenting his work and a signature part of his practice. And today we're very privileged to have the opportunity to watch William Young perform his famed monologue. Thank you all for joining us for this very, very special event, and certainly on behalf of the University and the Institute, IAC, our students and our staff, I'd like to thank William for being such an influential and inspirational artist and for exhibiting at Western Sydney University. I hope you all enjoy the exhibition.
Thank you so much, Vice-Chancellor, for this great speech, and I'm really looking forward to our trip and interrogation of machine translation, impact on translation or subtitling. Looking forward to it. I had worked at Espresso Subtitling for 23 years, and one day my daughter asked me, "Mum, do you get tired of doing subtitling?" Very good question. And I said, actually, no. I never got tired of doing subtitling because we never need to do one program twice. So we always move on to something new, which not every job offers you that. And I have the same experience or feeling with the artists that I've worked with. No two artists are the same. And there is always something new. It has been a pure joy of knowing and working with William Young. And I've learned so much from him, from his studying his artworks and from watching his performances. He is such a great artist and a very gifted storyteller, and also a very kind, frank, honest, and most generous person. While we always give our best care to the production of this presentation, and also we give our utmost respect to the artists that we all work with and also their work, we also feel incredibly privileged and honoured by William's trust. I'm so pleased when he first came here, he said the exhibition looked great. Because he didn't come when we installed, you can see how much trust he had on us, and it was the best moment. Please welcome William Young to give his monologue performance.
That's a photo of my mother. At the time, she was living with her eldest sister, my Aunt Bessie, older by 13 years. And my mother said to me, "Your Aunt Bessie was always sick. I brought up her children. Whenever there was a decision to be made, they'd come to me. I was the practical one. I ran the household and I learned to drive a car. Bessie never learned to drive a car. She never wanted to." So that's my Aunt Bessie and her husband, William Fang Yuan. She had an arranged marriage to William Fang Yuan, and he was a wealthy landowner from Marillion near Innisfail in North Queensland. And so the whole family, which was living in the Northern Territory, came over to live under Fang Yuan's roof, Chinese style, when they married. Bessie was 16 and Fang Yuan was 42. And the Chinese thought this was a very good match because Fang Yuan was rich. He had a company called Yuan Qi. That's him on the right. And he also had a shop and cane farms. But after Fang Yuan and Aunt Bessie had been married about 10 years, he was murdered. He was shot by a manager on one of his cane farms. We know the manager was he was a white Russian called Peter Danilchenko. And he shot Fang Yuan in cold blood. There was a trial and Peter Danilchenko was acquitted of first-degree murder. And the Chinese at the time felt that was a great miscarriage of justice. That's my father, Charlie Young. He played saxophone in a dance band. He owned a shop at Aloomba, just south of Cairns, but he had a social life in Cairns. He was part of the Chinese National Club. They were like the equivalent to the Young Liberals in Chinatown. And they supported the National Chinese Party in China. And it was a kind of a social club. And I think that my father met my mother, who was also living in Cairns at this stage. He had a shop. He moved the shop to Dimbula on the Atherton Tableland. And he'd been in Dimbula for about a year working the shop when he proposed to my mother. My mother said he wanted someone to help him with the shop. But at another time she told me she was madly in love with my father. And I think my mother was caught in two worlds. In the traditional Chinese world, marriage was nothing more than an economic contract. But my mother had seen Hollywood movies, and so she allowed herself the luxury of romance. I was born in Mareeba, a nearby town to Dimbula, because Dimbula didn't have a hospital. And I had a older sister, Frances, by 8 years, and an older brother, Alan, by 4 years. None of us learned to speak Chinese, partly because My father was Hakka, so he spoke Hakka, whereas my mother was Siyap, that was her clan, and she spoke Cantonese. So English was their common language, and that was what we spoke at home. My mother could have taught us Cantonese, but she never did. My mother wanted us to assimilate. She wanted us to be more Australian than the Australians. When I was about 6 years old, one of the kids at school called me Ching Chong Chinaman, born in a jar, christened in a teapot, ha ha ha. I had no idea what he was talking about, although I knew from his expression he was being horrible to me. So I went home to my mother and I said, "Mum, I'm not Chinese, am I?" And my mother looked at me very sternly and she said, "Yes, you are." Her tone was hard and it shocked me. And I knew in that moment that being Chinese was like some terrible curse. And I could not rely on my mother for help. Or my brother, who was 4 years older than me, very much more experienced in the world, he chimed in, "And you'd better get used to it." So my parents, after the war, my parents got a tobacco farm. It was more or less given to them in lieu of a debt that had accrued when they owned the shop. So they became tobacco farmers, and they had the farm for about 10 years, and they built their dream home, of which they were very proud of. So that's my brother on the right, Alan. He was attending the boarding school at Herberton. My sister Frances was a nurse at Mareeba Hospital, and later she was to travel as a nursing sister over to America, and she married a Japanese American, Paul Fukuda. And that's me. I was about to go to high school, which was the worst time of my life. People used to call me names. I wanted to be popular and to fit in, but my hair would not brush back at the sides, and there was no way that I could look like Elvis Presley. But worse, I had a dark secret. I somehow knew that I was attracted to men. I didn't quite know what that meant, but in Cairns, when I was about 16, I was reading the afternoon newspaper, and it had an article about homosexuality. And the article described what the condition was, and it named 3 famous ones in history. And when I read that, the shock of recognition rather hit me like a thunderbolt. I thought, oh God, there's a name for it. But although now I knew who I was, it didn't change anything. I still didn't know a single gay person in Cairns. I thought there were 4 homosexuals in the world. Oscar Wilde, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and me. Jump forward to 1984, where I'm a photographer in Sydney, and I learned Taoism, which is like a Chinese philosophy. It's not a religion. And it is through my engagement with this Chinese philosophy that I began to ask questions and embrace my Chinese heritage, which hitherto had been denied and unacknowledged. People at the time called me born-again Chinese. And that's not a bad description because there was a certain zealousness to the process. But now I see it as what have I written? But now I see it as a liberation from ethnic suppression. And I prefer to say that I came out as a Chinese. Now, after I came out as a Chinese, I researched my family. And I travelled up to North Queensland. I made a special trip of going up to North Queensland and talking to my relatives, many of whom I'd never really engaged with before. And I wanted to ask them about my murdered uncle, William Fang Nguyen. So I travelled up there and I talked to my relatives, and some of them knew him, but they all had a different story about what happened to him in the murder. Some thought that they were playing at cards, and Fang Nguyen, Peter Daniel Shenko shot him. And another person who knew Fang Nguyen said, oh, he was paying him some money, and he dismissively threw the money on the floor. And so this so outraged the White Russian that he shot Fang Nguyen in cold blood. But at the end of the day, I went to the Innisfail courthouse and I found documents about the trial of Peter Daniel Shenko. And I also found this police sketch of the murder. Very graphic. It's like a photograph of its time. And when I saw that and when I tried to piece together the stories that I'd told, I found out that a lot of the stories were extremely distorted, but they had a grain of truth to them. One story was that the bullet ricocheted off a windowsill and hit Fang Nguyen. But there was a bullet was found lodged in a windowsill, so it wasn't quite accurate, but there were elements of truth. And Fang Nguyen was holding these documents when he died, and they were in an envelope at the Innisfail courthouse, and they were the blood-splattered documents, and that's Fang Nguyen's blood on these documents. It was like a brown crystalline stain. And I've deduced that what they argued about was the weight of cane that went on trucks to the mill. And so that was the reason why they had the falling out. My mother gave evidence at this trial. She never told me about it. She was only 16 when she gave evidence. And I feel that the legacy of this murder came down to me in that my own mother suppressed my ethnicity. She wanted us to assimilate. She didn't want us to be Chinese. And in fact, I've grown up until the age of 33, completely denying that I was Chinese. In fact, when I moved to Sydney and I was in my mid-20s, people would ask me, are you a Colombo student? Because there were many Colombo students in Australia at that time. And I'd say, yes, just to shut down the conversation. So I put those stories into a performance piece called Sadness. Now, I'd started by this stage, this is 1992, to do performance pieces very similar to what I'm doing now, talking with image projection. And so my uncle's murder was the big story in Sadness. And there was also a second story to Sadness, which was about the gay community, that people in the early 90s were dying of AIDS. And I realised when I looked at my collection of photographs that I'd been to more funerals than I'd been to parties. But I decided to go with that. And so Sadness was the result of that. And because Sadness was very much about the issues of the day, people dying of AIDS, AIDS was terrifying everyone all over the world. It was a huge success, and I toured it nationally in Australia and also internationally. And so I kind of forged a festival circuit around the world, and many of the presenters overseas would take my next piece. In the past, because of the way I was brought up, I did not value my own story. So this is a flyer I made for another piece about my family. It's called The North. It followed Sadness. All my pieces have kind of climbed up on the back of Sadness. And it was about specifically my childhood in North Queensland. And so it's very much about claiming my story. That was in 1996. But in 2009, I was part of an exhibition called the China Project at Goma in Brisbane. And so I redid my family story for a gallery, and they're huge prints, because if you can see down the bottom, there's a person at the desk, so they're really big prints. And because they were destroyed when the exhibition finished, I made a smaller version of it, which really should be in the exhibition, but it was too big to get framed. So I did this smaller version, and I wrote on it, "All these people are my blood relatives, and all are descended from Ang Si Wing, who came to Australia from Guangdong Province, China, in the 1890s. Now the descendants are scattered around the world as part of the Chinese diaspora. The blood is mixed with that of Irish, Latvian, Japanese, Italian, Indian, Vietnamese, and Australian." My mother had a dignity that came, I think, from a position of humility. I never noticed this while she was alive. Heavens, there was the whole relationship between me and my mother to obscure it. But now, 11 years after she died, as I print up this photograph in the darkroom, I notice it. That's my sister Frances in the red vest. She went over to America and she stayed there, and she had 3 children, 3 boys, John, Robert and William, who are in that photograph. And that's most of the people there are William's family. And actually Frances came to Brisbane the that year because my brother Alan died in 2010, and her and Robert, who came over, were able to meet my partner Scott, and so they got to know him. And so this is the first time I took Scott over to California, Orange County, for Christmas. And so this is like the family portrait, 2011. And this is a self-portrait in a more general sense of the word, because I'm standing at the Chinese diggings at Lambing Flat, where at the current city of Young. And there was an incident where the Chinese gold diggers in 1861 were driven off the gold fields by an angry mob of European and Australian diggers, and they'd painted a flag on a tent flap which said, roll up, no Chinese. And it was done in that Barnum and Barnum circus scroll, and it's unfinished. But that flag, or that banner, is in the Young Museum. And when I was actually researching the Chinese travelling around in Australia, I'd heard about the riots at Lambing Flat, but I went into the Young Museum, this was in 1990 or some date like that, and I saw this flag, and it absolutely floored me, because it was just one of those experiences where you see something and you kind of recognise it, and in that moment history becomes vivid. And so this was taken many years later. I happened to be in Young with a busload of people, Chinese people from the History Society, and we were going up to the Lambing Flat Festival. So I came out as a gay man in the early 70s. I moved from Brisbane to Sydney, and I was kind of swept out by events at the time. So it was fairly painless coming out as a gay man in those times, because they were turbulent times, the 70s. And this is a photograph I took of some Asian friends, and it says, "Please don't put me in your exhibition. I still live at home. No one knows about me. Put Norman in. He likes things like that. He wants to be in it. I'm not ready yet." And so that's probably about being in the closet. And so if the Mardi Gras started in 1978, this photograph is from 24 years later, where I initiated a group called Asian Lesbian and Gay Pride. And we had seminars and parties where we kind of discussed issues like what it is like to be gay and Asian in a predominantly Anglo-gay community. And we used to have parties at the Chinese gardens. We'd call them Chinese New Year parties because it was at the same time as Mardi Gras, and they were great fun. This is a publicity photograph for the Year of the Snake. And so this isn't a Asian lesbian and gay pride group, but these people were kind of associated with it, and they're just doing a performance number at the Katana Club, which was a club for gay Asians. And around about this time, I did this self-portrait, which I call Alter Ego, and it's about me looking at a very attractive Asian man and thinking of my own, coming to terms with my own attractiveness as an Asian gay person. This is at my survey, a big survey exhibition at the State Library of New South Wales. And these are the group from the Lesbian and Gay Pride group. And they're here wishing me well. They were genuinely happy with my success. 'Cause sometimes I suspect people aren't that happy about my success, but they were. And so I've written on it, in the 90s, I was active with Asian Lesbian and Gay Pride. Here, I felt I had found kindred spirits. And I've called this photo, I've Been Loved. And this is Ben Law, very famous young Asian young man. And I saw a photograph of him where he had stubble painted on his face, and so I reproduced that idea, and I call this one Hair Envy. This is in 2011, I started doing storytelling workshops with this group, with Annette Chunwo and I. It was called then Performance 4A, and it's since morphed into contemporary Asian Australian performance. But we did our very first storytelling event called Stories East and West. And there were 6 storytellers, and they told their stories. And at a workshop, it was a weekend workshop, and then it went on to become we went on to do it about 4 times, and each time it just got a bit bigger. And the third time, when we did it at the Belvoir, we felt we could charge people money to come and see it. But this storytelling event went on, and it became the basis of many of CARP, Contemporary Asian Australian Performance, shows. And Annette and I have done at least half a dozen shows. And Tessa Leong, who's here, she is now the president or the leader of CARP, and she has worked with me on some of these storytelling events as well. Now, Mai was in this. I'll go back. That's my third from the right. And I invested quite a lot of time on Mai. She had a very complex story. She was half Vietnamese, half Australian. And so we continued our friendship after the project. And so I decided to adopt her as my daughter in that very loose way that Asian people adopt people. And so she's now my adopted daughter. She's one of my big success. I've adopted other people, but my is my successful adoption. Now, this is a photograph from the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Claire Roberts curated a show. It was called Contemporary Chinese Art, and it was 1992. And in the 90s, there was a kind of blooming of contemporary Chinese painters, mainly. Some of them came out here after the Tiananmen Square incident, and Claire was the partner of Nick Jose, who was the cultural attaché in Beijing. And so the embassies were quite instrumental in introducing many Chinese artists to the West. And so there was an awareness of contemporary Chinese art in the early 90s in Sydney. And this is the year before at Jean Sherman's gallery, where there's Arsian, Lucian, and Guan Wei. They all showed at Jean Sherman's gallery. And this is Shen Jiawei, who did a portrait of me for the Archibald Prize. This is in 1999. And he's gone on to become very famous as a portrait painter, which I'm sure you all know about him. Guo Jian in 1998, and I became very good friends with Guo Jian, partly because he spoke really good English, and so it was really easy to have conversations with him. And the last photo is of Lindy Li, who is an Australian-born Chinese contemporary artist, and her story is very similar to mine, very similar to my story, Annette Chunwo's story, where there are many points of intersection where we live in both cultures and we have to claim our Chinese heritage because of the way we were brought up. And in fact, we identify as Australian. I first went to China in 1989, and I've written on this, and I call this photo The Disguise. I travelled through China in an imperfect disguise. I looked the part, but whenever I opened my mouth to talk, I betrayed the fact that I couldn't speak the language. Now, this was my first visit to China, and there's a person there who's second from the left called Bao Naiyong, and he was my host. He was a photographer whom I met in Australia, and he was a bit of a rebel, and he was determined to show me China. So the best time I had was in his country of Inner Mongolia, and he worked in the steelworks, and this is the special common room of the Baotou Steelworks. And when I got into this common room, see that big book, the white book on the table? They said, "Oh, you've got to sign the visitor's book." And so I thought for a while, and so I wrote in it, "Today I had a most interesting time visiting the steel works, taking photos, meeting the workers, eating lunch, talking to the directors, making friends. I am beginning to understand the workings of the plant, which makes me understand a little more about the workings of this great vast country, China. Thank you for your most generous hospitality." And then I wrote my name, and I kind of paused about whether I'd actually write my name in Chinese, which I could just do, but everybody else had such great calligraphic hands, which were greatly prized by all the Chinese. But anyway, I wrote my name in my babyish kindergarten style, and it was a moment because I've forgotten how to write my name now. But anyway, the girl who's third from the left, when she saw this, when she saw what I'd written, she said, "What you've written's very interesting." And I said, "Why is that?" "You've communicated your feelings to the workers and they like you very much." I said, "I think they like me because I look Chinese." She replied, "That's true. The blood of China runs in your veins." Now, when the girl said those words to me, I was overcome with a fierce emotion which I'll call homecoming. I'd come back to my second home. So Mr. Bao took me to visit the master steel carver, and I was very taken by his carved seals. And on a different trip, I visited Toisan. Now, it's the area where my mother comes from. I told you my mother was Si Yup, but I've lost all connection with my mother's family, and so I went there, and I went to the overseas Chinese department, and they showed me around. They took me to lunch, but I was very small fry because there are overseas Chinese who give the group thousands, millions of dollars. They're quite rich. And so I had a kind of generic tour of the place of my ancestors. But I wasn't really looking too hard for relatives, to be honest, because I'd had such great experiences with Mr. Bao, and I'd heard a few nightmare scenarios where people had found relatives and it didn't quite work out. and I'd already had kind of experiences where the Chinese all thought that just because you're from the West, you're a millionaire, and that annoyed me. And so I just thought I'd let sleeping dogs lie. And this is on another trip to China, where I was in the middle of China, and it's in some ways the middle of China is right off the tourist circuit. I mean, there's Beijing, Xi'an, Shanghai, Canton, Guilin. They're like the big centres, but in the centre of China, I was in this quite big town. There were hardly any Westerners there. But I went to the Shaolin temple, and I took the photos of these acolytes. Now, this is at the Pangaea Yuan markets. And I was in China in 2008, which is the year of the Olympics. And I was there. Someone had asked me to come over and photograph Beijing for a book, a big book. They'd asked over, I think, photographers from all over the world to get their view of Beijing, and they're going to bring out this coffee table book for the Olympics. So I went over and I took the photos. They actually recommend that I go to these markets, which are very interesting. What drew me, of course, was the depiction of the Cultural Revolution in this statuette form. But nothing came of the book, and I think it's because really, basically, the Chinese who were, they weren't high up, but the Chinese on the lower level of this, they really weren't interested in my or the other photographers' view of China, because what they really wanted is to reproduce their view of China. But they didn't want a different view. They wanted their view reinforced, and so it just didn't work out. And I took this photograph. What it is calligraphy in stone, which is half erased. And I thought that was a very good image and metaphor of China erasing history and the effort that you have to go through to erase something from stone. Because I can't speak the language, there's only a certain penetration I can make into China. And even my best experiences tend to reinforce the fact that I'm Australian. And so I guess I mean by this is that you form a cultural identity about everything that's around you. It's your parents, the view of your parents, what you listen to in the radio, what other people tell you, what you learn, the books you read. And so you have this cultural identity. And if you try to... I had wanted to be Chinese, but I couldn't really form a cultural identity because I just didn't have that experience of growing up in China. And if I tried to take away my Australian cultural identity, there'd be nothing left, because that's really what you are. And so I call myself Australian, but I acknowledge the fact that I have Chinese ancestry. There's a Chinese saying that everyone should climb Huangshan, the Yellow Mountain, at least once before they die. And although I carry on about China being impenetrable to me, I guess I identified strong enough to being Chinese to go over to China in 2005 and climb some of the sacred mountains as a kind of pilgrimage and acknowledgement of my heritage. And among those mountains was Huangshan, the Yellow Mountain. Thank you.
What a wonderful stories William has also told us they're so touching and so moving and kind of simple, but you can all relate from his family, the way he grew up, and the uncle being murdered, every single bit that he can strung into a wonderful, wonderful story. And William, one thing, can you adopt me? It's a very loose Chinese style. I'm orphan now, so you can, and it will be a success. Our guest speaker, Tessa Leung, is a theatre director, dramaturg, and a collaborator who has worked extensively across theatre, performance, dance theatre, live art, and socially engaged projects. She was the Griffith Theatre Company's inaugural Associate Artistic Director from 2020 to 2022, and is now the Artistic Director of the Contemporary Asian Australian Performance, CARP, which William mentioned. And it was Annette Chua, the former director of CARP and a former member of this institute's advisory board, who connected us together through our partnership for the CARP Artist Lab in 2020, when I met Tessa as the co-partner. The IAC is a partner again to CARP Artist Lab 2.0, and this year under the directorship of Tessa. And William had just mentioned that he has had this very special and long-standing relationship with CARP. So no one would suit better than Tessa to be the guest speaker at this opening. Please welcome Tessa Leung, the Artistic Director of CARP, to give us a
I would also like to acknowledge that we are meeting here this afternoon on the lands of the Parramatta Gul. I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I think especially in the conversation of heritage, it's essential that we consider where we are and remind ourselves that many of us are settlers here on this land, whether from recently or from long ago. It's a real honour to be asked to speak here to open William Young's Claiming Heritage exhibition. I'd like to show my appreciation to the Vice-Chancellor for his commitment to and celebration of William Young and of art here tonight. It is through these events, actions and connections, through deep thinking and research, collaboration with each other, and a coming together of ideas that I actually think that we can change the world. I'd also like to thank Jing Han and Nicholas Ng for asking me to speak here. It's a real honour. Now I'm going to attempt to speak openly and honestly in the spirit of William's performance, but I certainly will fall short, and it is certainly a very hard act to follow. And I don't mean that just today, but I also mean as an artist and an arts leader. I've had the privilege of knowing William for years now, and his influence on me as a person, in my career, and an artist is very hard to quantify. In fact, me standing here today would not be happening if it weren't for William. As he mentioned, contemporary Asian Australian performance is actually part of his legacy with Annette Chua. He was instrumental in the founding and inception of the Asian Australian Artists Association in 1996, the creation of Gallery Foray, to the beginning of Performance Foray in 2004, through to the name change, which we currently have, which is Contemporary Asian Australian Performance. William has been part of the organising committees and then the board of Performance Foray and Contemporary Asian Australian Performance since 2004 up until last year, when I took the reins, which of course I don't take personally. It's William's work with Annette and the creation of Performance Foray, which then in turn became CARP, that leads directly to where I stand today. It's through their vision, their support, dedication to Asian Australian artists, and through their change-making and agitating attitudes that myself and a lot of other people have got to do things that they actually never dreamed of prior. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I would like to honour a kind of inheritance that has come about, and that is of the Asian Australian artist variety. William has done things that no one previous to him dreamed of doing. He has taken pictures, spoken words in a form entirely of his own creation. William, with his pictures and his words, draws previously invisible links between people and places, events and times, and makes them known by inviting you in. William has not only toured his own full work and his own remarkable photographs across Australia and the world, inviting people into sacred and intimate worlds, but he's also given birth to a considerable catalogue of new works with Performance Foray and Contemporary Asian Australian Performance. His work with Annette as co-directors and other storytellers, as he mentioned, with Stories East and West, Stories Then and Now, The Backstories with Razak Muhammad, Moya Dodd and Chong Lu, Who Speaks for Me and Lost in Shanghai with Jane Hutchin, have showed the reach and the impact of William's stories plus pictures form. The works have created a platform for other voices, celebrating and exposing, inviting people into complexity and nuance, showing vulnerability and heart. This form has also been embraced by other CARP shows with other directors at the helm. There may have been music added or food, but they all keep close to this beautiful form that carries on William's storytelling mode. Some of them have been Serpent's Table, In Between Two, and Double Delicious. I first met and worked with William on another work called Life-Giving Stories. This is a project that is shared actually between Contemporary Asian Australian Performance and Multicultural Health New South Wales. It encourages organ and tissue donation in culturally and linguistically diverse communities across Sydney. It's very, very sensitive work. And it's about working with people who have either received life through donation and also with families who have lost loved ones in tragic circumstances and chosen to donate organs to offer life to others. Working with William, I got to see up close his care and consideration, but also his unwavering artistic vision. He is clear and he has an ability to talk openly and honestly about very difficult subjects, even with new storytellers. Since I have tried to bring that careful and considered approach along with clarity and vision to every project. I like to encourage rehearsal rooms that can hold difficult conversations, always keeping the audience experience in mind and allowing space around big ideas and big emotions for people to make up their own minds and follow their own hearts. It's William's work as a photographer and a performance maker and an artist that is completely exceptional. He captures intimate, expressive, joyous or tragic moments and provides a resonant message that seems to increase the reach of each image when he groups them and arranges them and provides context through the written or spoken word. He manages to speak volumes. The practice and what we've seen this afternoon first began as William began to write on his photos, and this transformed into what I hear people speak of as creating actually really quite interesting slide nights in the 1990s, obviously opposed to everyone else's very boring ones. As evidenced by this afternoon, and indeed his recent major work, Gay Sydney, a memoir, which recently premiered at Sydney World Pride, we know that William knows how to tell a story. What astonishes me is that he at once feels completely himself and present with his audience, and yet he is also what I would consider a master of restraint. He is wonderfully dry in his humour, cheeky in his approach, not just to his subjects but also to his audience, and captivating in the things that he holds back, allowing you to fall into voids with questions and curiosities. William's journey into claiming heritage, his open discussions about coming out as gay and also coming out as Chinese, endure as not only intellectually incisive, but wonderfully playful ways to frame questions of identity. Growing up in a household with English as my first language, but being seen by many as Chinese or Asian Australian, I drew great relief from reading about William's journey. He has an openness and honesty about his heritage, and also that there is diversity and richness to acknowledging different kinds of Asianness, Australianness, gayness, or queerness. This exhibition celebrates William and his astonishing body of work. And I know that these are but a very impressive handful compared to the tens of thousands of pictures he must have taken and exhibited across his lifetime. However, in these, and from this performance tonight, we bear witness to a poignant journey of William's path to self-discovery. He welcomes us in to consider and to honour those who have come before, but also displays the complexities and nuances of his own coming into himself. In considering this journey and this collection, I see a quiet but radical artist who has changed the course of performance in this country and redefined artistic approaches to identity and representation before anyone even used those words. Thank you, William, for being an inspiration to so many with all your precious talents. We follow in your footsteps as artists, hoping one day we can meet the challenge of creating such beautiful, radical, and incredible work.
In closing this ceremony, I would like to thank again William Young. Thank you so much. And the Vice-Chancellor, which is so lucky to have you and have your support. And obviously Tessa Leung, and also Nathan, Jules, and Nick. It's wonderful. Must also thank Simon Chen, the director of Art Atrium, who has been a tremendous help to me and to us in having William Young's exhibition here. Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank Western Creative Curator Margaret Hancock. Where are you? Yeah. For her great help and guidance when we installed the artwork. And also lastly, I must thank my team, small as we are, but we're very efficient and hard work. Yanni Liu and Declan Lickerson and Lindsay Liu, as well as our highly qualified volunteers, Song Tao, Gawa, Iris Wang, were all my PhD students. And two new volunteers, Cindy and Celine, and who are students from Vietnam. So thank you so much. And thank you all for your support, and to us and to Art and to William. I want to draw your attention that we have this book that Art Atrium has provided, only 10 copies. Brilliant book, and about William, I was published last year. So if you would like to have a copy, and you can buy a copy and get signed by William today. And it's really a good book. And also please enjoy drinks and light refreshments, as well as viewing the exhibition and enjoying your mingling. Thank you so much for coming. Good night.